Hi, this is Morgan Freeman, lending my voice to this valuable documentary. On January 3rd, 2024, Johnny and Pee-wee flew from Chicago to Atlanta, then changed planes for the 4.5-hour flight to Bogota's El Dorado Airport. In Bogota, they stayed in a 2-bedroom, 2-bath Airbnb with great views of the city. But they had to endure a rooster somewhere in the neighborhood that started his crowing at 2 a.m. and kept it up until noon. Pee-wee made good use of the white noise app on his phone during this stay. On this trip, they typically spent their first day in a new city doing a walking tour. In Bogota, they learned about Simon Bolivar's fight for independence and the ongoing battles between right and left political factions. We learned about the Bogotazo, the name for the April 1948 riot. It started after a popular left-wing politician was assassinated on this corner. Our tour guide told us she learned in English by watching a lot of American TV, particularly the series House. After the walking tour, they stopped for a typical Colombian lunch. This one was a potato and chicken soup called ajiaco. It was created for laborers working in the fields, so it's very filling. Pee-wee needed a nap after that one. The second full day in Bogota was spent hitting museums. Francisco Botero is probably the most famous artist to come from Colombia, known for what he calls fat figures. There's a museum in his name full of his paintings and sculptures, but also works from artists such as Picasso and Van Gogh. After seeing all those fat figures, Pee-wee was on the mood for some American food, like the Subway Italiano. And after that, they stopped at an outdoor cafe that featured a rotation of pretty good street performers. The third day in Bogota was a sunny Saturday, a good day to take Bogota in from the best vantage point in the city, Montserrat. Some people make the hike up the hill on foot, but Pee-wee and Johnny got the senior discount on the cable car, which meant they had plenty of money left over for sunscreen. The last day in Bogota, they attended Sunday Mass at the Salt Cathedral, a 45-minute ride from the city. What was once a small chapel built underground by miners, it has been expanded into one of the largest attractions in the area. Before heading back to town, they enjoyed a lunch of river trout at one of the local joints. The next day, they hopped a flight from Bogota to Pereira, the heart of coffee country. At the Pereira airport, they hired a driver for the day. The first stop would be the Cocora Valley, located inside the Los Nevados National Park. The valley is listed as a must-see in the guidebooks because of the giant wax palm trees, the national tree of Colombia, which is found here. They could have spent 2 hours hiking to the top of the hills, but decided the view from the valley was just as good. Plus, they had other sights they wanted to see before getting to their Airbnb that evening, and traffic was heavy on the narrow roads inside the national park. On the way back from the valley, they stopped at an American-owned restaurant named Brunch. Pee-wee got the waffles. But after the heavy meal, they needed to walk around the colorful town of Salento to work some of that off.
This is Salento again.
Then it was back in the car for the 2-hour drive to the thermales or hot springs of Santa Rosa, another must-see in the guidebooks. But they were exhausted from the driver's constant chatter. Pee-wee had never spoken that much Spanglish in his life. Even when he told the driver he was too tired to talk, the caddy kept chattering. And to make matters worse, by the time they got to the hot springs, the tickets were sold out. There's a big thermal pool there, and they had to limit the tickets. Nothing to do but get back in the car and get to the town of Manizales and their Airbnb. The next morning, they woke up in Manizales and explored the historical center near their Airbnb. Manizales is a very hilly city with an altitude of 7,200 feet. Shani would have to catch her breath after a steep climb up one of the streets. Back at the Airbnb, she tried to jump out a window, but the steel bar stopped her. That afternoon, they toured a nearby coffee farm, Hacienda Venezia. They learned all about the production of coffee beans and their exportation. Neither were ever coffee drinkers, but sampled various blends of coffee beans. They were not won over. The next day in Matazalis, their last, they toured the Recinto de Pensamiento, translated as the Area of Thought. It's a large nature park, and they signed up for a 2-hour nature walk. The 1 hour of that seemed to be sitting or standing and watching for birds, particularly hummingbirds, which never showed. On the walk, there happened to be the natural tree of Chile, the Araucario. Pee-wee was the only one in the tour group that knew that, and brought that fact up more than once. The park also featured a butterfly enclosure, which they felt they spent way too much time in, and finally had to tell this kid to move it along. On the long bus ride back to the Airbnb, what was later referred to as the incident came to pass. Maybe it was the coffee beans from the day before, or the brunch from the day before that. But suddenly, Johnny jumped from the bus and ran into the mall in search of a bathroom. When she came out, all she said was, "We gotta get out of here." Not sure what happened in there, and for the rest of the time in Colombia, the pair kept their eyes open for wanted posters with their images on them. Having completed their first week in Colombia, the next morning, Thursday, January 11th, they flew from Manizales to Medellin in just 35 minutes. The apartment was a little older, but it was well located near the tram line. The same afternoon, they took a walking tour of the historical center, La Candelaria. They discovered that Medellin is one of the noisiest cities in the world. Every street vendor had a loudspeaker repeating the same words over and over at a high pitch. Another thing they discovered is that people don't like to talk about Medellin's most famous figure, Pablo Escobar. They want to improve the city's reputation to bring in more tourists. Friday morning, they made their own tour of the city's museums and sites. They weren't sure what any of the art was supposed to mean, but it was air-conditioned inside. The artist Francisco Botero was born and started his career here, and there's an outdoor plaza of many of his sculptures. They found that the city had some quieter spaces, mostly within the museums and older buildings, like here in the Palacio Nacional. They grabbed a late lunch and that evening got the last table at the local jazz club. Their last day in Medellin, they took a cable car up to the Ego Park for a hike and a great view of the city.
You actually have to take 2 cable cars to get up here.
The next day, Monday, they flew from Medellin to Santa Marta, a 1-hour flight. In Santa Marta, they visited the office of Expo Tour to pay the balance of the 4-day hike they would be starting the next day. Their Airbnb was once again an older building, but it was walking distance to the center of town. They woke up early Tuesday to meet the van that would be taking them to the start of the hike. Once there, the guides explained to their group of 15 the route that they would be taking to the lost city. The first day was just 4 hours of hiking and on mostly paved road, but it was mostly uphill. Fortunately, they took breaks every hour. As you can see, Pee-wee and Johnny were the oldest hikers on the tour. They were also the only Americans, the rest coming from Europe. That evening, they stopped at camp. Some of the group went for a swim in the river, but Pee-wee and Johnny needed a break. That night, they slept in bunk beds with mosquito netting, a step up from the tents on their childhood camping trips. After a good night's sleep, they woke up at 5:30 for breakfast and a full day of hiking. This would prove to be the toughest day of the 4, almost 15 miles, mostly uphill. Mid-morning they stopped at an indigenous village. The guide explained it was mostly empty because the tribes keep separate homes up in the hills. The village is used for ceremonies and meetings. They also received a lecture on indigenous ways and music from one of the tribe. Pee-wee and Johnny found that nowhere near as entertaining as the performance put on by their guides.
Así mantiene, mira, hay que trabajando y ahí mantiene mamando gallo, mira. El otro también lo acompaña, también lo apoya, mira, mira.
Aquí llegó el negro fino. Ahora baila en limosina.
After lunch, the group started on what the guides called the happy hour of the hike. 1 hour of uphill on muddy, slippery trails. Johnny kept asking, "Are we there yet?" Only to turn the corner and see yet another climb. They finally made it to the camp around 5, and these Dutch girls celebrated with some beer and popcorn. Then it was a shower, dinner, and off to sleep. The good thing was, when they woke the next morning, they were less than an hour's hike from the lost city. Unfortunately, it was an hour on a narrow stone stairway. But they finally made it. Time to celebrate and take some photos. The group was able to spend the rest of the morning exploring the various levels of the city. The big chiefs had their homes up on the highest levels. The ruins had been raided over the years, and now all that remained, unfortunately, were the stone outlines of where those homes once were. After lunch at the camp, the group spent the afternoon climbing down the same steep trail they had climbed up the day before. Pee-wee found it easier on his heart, but tougher on his knees. After 4 hours, they made it to camp. This would be their last night in the bunk beds, and they were already looking forward to their air-conditioned Airbnb. Day 4 of the hike, the last, and it would be a tough one. 8 hours of up and down. At lunch, the guide said, "I think we need to put Johnny on a motorbike to the end point. It would cost $20, but Johnny said she'd take it from Luke's inheritance." She said it was the ride of her life. The young girl piloting the bike knew just what she was doing as they bounced along the dirt path. Meanwhile, Pee-wee spent the afternoon walking alongside some German techies, trying to get them to invest in a miniature golf/go-kart track at the base of the lost city. They made it back to their Airbnb in Santa Marta and celebrated by ordering in some KFC. The next day was a day to sleep late, catch up on some emails, and do laundry. They grabbed some lunch at an outdoor cafe by the ocean and spent the afternoon wandering the streets in Santa Marta. On Sunday, they took a rather crowded bus from downtown Santa Marta for the 1-hour ride to the bucolic town of Minga, where they had lunch and visited the springs, where Pee-wee sat upon a rock and prophesied about the money he'd make bringing the Tommy Bartlett ski show here.
Oh, sorry. Oh, shit. What?
On Monday, their last day in Santa Marta, they took another bus ride, this one 90 minutes, to the Caribbean beach of Palomino. That's Pee-wee headed into the water. You know, from a distance, you can't even see his actinic keratoses. The next day, they bought tickets from the bus to Cartagena. They were hoping for a Greyhound-sized bus with a bathroom on board, and were disappointed when a 15-passenger van pulled up. They got the last 2 seats on the van. The trip took about 5 hours. For some reason, there are no flights between the 2 cities. They checked into their Airbnb, a 2-bedroom, 2-bath, with a nice view of the beach. Cartagena is hot and humid. It was cloudless and in the 90s the entire week of their visit. As was their custom, they started their first day in Cartagena with a walking tour. They learned about how the walls were built to protect against invaders such as the British and pirates. But with the bright sun, they went extra heavy on the sunscreen and wide-brim hats. To take a break from the sun from time to time, they'd find a nice, cool church, a museum, a restaurant, or even a bit of shade in a park. The following day, they visited the San Felipe Castle, the site of more battles between the Spaniards and the French, and then the Spaniards and the British. It was another hot, sunny day. Pee-wee flexing here says, with guns like these, who needs cannons? They found that it was so exceedingly hot during the day that it was better to wait until the sun went down to visit some parts of the city. There was something called the Frito Festival going on, which involved live music and a lot of fried food. These cats were hoping that Pee-wee was a sloppy eater. In the neighborhood of Gethsemane, there was some live music, but the quality was a little lacking. They spent an entire week in Cartagena, but ran out of sights to see within about 3 days. Pee-wee was content to sit under some trees at the beach and read a book. Johnny preferred to take long walks through the city or explore the shopping malls. On one of their last days, they did manage to get to the highest point in Cartagena, El Convento de la Polpa. It was built by the Augustinians back in the 1600s, and there still are a few of them living there, though none of them admitted to knowing G-Man. Pee-wee and Johnny would soon say goodbye to Colombia and board a flight to Ecuador. Stay tuned.